A racially prejudiced woman traveling alone at night. A hard-working black man just wanting to get home. The two cross each other's paths, but a shocking event ensues that would change both their lives forever. Traveling after midnight, Jane sat by the window of a bus, gazing out at the buildings, the vacant sidewalks, and the streetlights as she passed by, her mind exhausted and overwhelmed by the arduous tasks she had to complete at work. Jane would normally leave work at 5, catch a bus, and be home by 7 or 8 at the latest. But today, Jane was told to stay back and work overtime, and she was finally relieved of her duties at 10 p.m. Jane lived very far from her workplace, and the distance between them would often take at least 1.5 to 2 hours until arrival. So she would have to get up extra early in the mornings in order to make it for work and leave as soon as her shift was up to make it home before it got too late. But tonight, late caught up with her, and she was unable to reach home as early as she would have liked. Since she had to get up so early in the mornings, Jane had become accustomed to sleeping on the bus through most of the journey and would wake up around the time where she was close to her destination, as she had done just now before waking up to admire the streetlights. She leaned up off the window pane and rested her palm on the vacant seat to her right, her eyes rotating around the scanty bus as she listened to the wind fluttering in her ears. Normally, the bus would be packed with people, so much that Jane would barely manage to find an empty seat sometimes and would often end up having to stand on her feet for the entire journey. But tonight, only a handful of people were present on the bus. Jane was not used to being in an empty bus with few people, and she felt weird with having the room to breathe and all the arm space in the world. There was no loud chatter in her ears the whole trip. No one to beg her or ask her for anything. No one to be rubbed up on her body or be needlessly touching her. No one to randomly open unwanted conversations with her. No one to blast loud music from their devices and disturb the bus. No rowdy kids that would cause trouble. The bus was peaceful for a change, and she wished that it was always like this during the days. While rummaging through her thoughts about the change of atmosphere, Jane felt her body leaning forward without her command, the seats crunching as the driver pulled the brakes, halting the bus to a stop. She looked out the window curiously to see a tall, dark-skinned, and muscled man standing at a bus stop before the vehicle with his arm held out into the road, having on a sleeveless hoodie, sweatpants, and a sports cap over his head that covered his eyes. The man walked toward the doors of the bus with Jane's eyes following him closely, subjectively scanning him from head to toe as he patiently waited on the doors to open, his bag slugged over his broad shoulders. And from the moment he stepped upon the bus to the moment he passed the driver, and began making his way along the middle path. Jane's eyes stayed attached to him like a hawk, her stare becoming more tense the more he walked through the bus. Seeing him come closer to where her seat was, her heart sank. And she reached her hands down to her lap, clutching her purse tightly as she looked directly into his face with a sulk expression, her head fully positioned towards his body. The man walked past Jane without returning a glance at her and sat in a seat behind hers, immediately turning his face to the window without a care. Jane nervously tilted her head to the window on her left, slowly attempting to look behind her without it seeming too obvious. She felt uncomfortable with him sitting right behind her, especially when the bus had so many unoccupied seats. Why would he choose to sit there, she thought. Jane quickly got up from her seat and walked 3 more rows up to sit on the other side of the bus, closer to the front, where another man of a much paler complexion sat in the seat before her. As she sat down, she turned her head back to look at the chocolate-skinned man, a timid glare in her eyes as she watched him stare nonchalantly out the window, watching the stores, alleys, and avenues go by. The man wasn't paying any attention to Jane, yet she felt greatly bothered by his presence. Was it his exposed muscles that troubled her? Was it the stern look in the face, the fact that his eyes were barely visible? Or was it his clothes? Jane pondered to herself, trying to figure out why this man made her uncomfortable. She couldn't quite understand, but something just felt wrong ever since he entered the bus. His kind shouldn't be here, she thought. Jane could not put a finger on it, but something about this made her extremely uncomfortable. He was wearing a hoodie, and the lowered brim of his hat hid his eyes. In the dark of the night, no one would want to sacrifice clear visibility unless they intended to mask their identity to do wrong. He looked more like a ruffian than a decent human being. Jane thought, remembering various news reports she had heard. Could it be that he would try to rob everyone on the bus? Bearing these thoughts in her mind, Jane made sure to look over her shoulder every now and then to monitor him and to make sure she could see in case he tried to pull anything funny. She had heard many stories of people matching his description committing different crimes, and the most frightening cases always happened at night, a time when people are most vulnerable. Not to mention the many reports of people being held at gunpoint and getting robbed. Jane worked very hard all her life to get where she is now, and she felt she couldn't afford to lose all the fruits of her labor. She had her phone, house keys, a small makeup kit, a tiny box of mint gum, and small amounts of cash, along with all of her bank cards, which held all of her earnings that she had worked hard for, all stored inside her purse. She clutched the purse anxiously, dreading the thought of the man taking it from her. He would probably take everything inside, she thought. Her cash, all her cards, and even her phone. And she would not even be able to contact the police or anyone for help. With this perception, she snuck a look behind her, seeing him with his hoodie now over his head, shrouding his entire face in shadows. Jane felt an overwhelming sense of unease and turned her eyes off of him facing ahead, trying to ignore the presence of the strange man seated at the back of the bus. She was filled with dread and fidgeted nervously in her seat each time as he tried to look over her shoulder, casting short furtive glances in his direction. She continued to sneak glances at the man until he turned his head from the window and his eyes locked with hers, his stern gaze causing her to spin around in her seat frantically, holding her head stiff and straight ahead. As the wheels of the bus rolled across the moonlit streets, Jane could sense the tension building in the air, feeling his eyes melting in the back of her neck. She had been staring too much and brought attention to herself. What if he figured out that she was onto him? She asked herself as she looked out her window, eyes wide, watching the buildings go by. Still feeling his eyes upon her, she reached into her purse and pulled out her phone, quickly opening up an app to scroll mindlessly through social media in an attempt to distract herself from the man's unsettling presence. But no matter how hard she tried to ignore him, she could still feel his eyes boring into her, sending cold shivers down her spine. After scrolling for minutes on end, Jane finally held her head up once more, her eyes leaned to the left as she anxiously pondered looking behind her again. Was the man still looking at her? Is he coming for her? She asked herself, contemplating turning her head around.
Is everything all right, young lady?
A voice interrupted the silence of the bus. Jane's eyes darted all over the bus anxiously, until she looked up and saw the driver's face in the rearview mirror. The driver lifted his eyes in the mirror, looking at her reflection with a benevolent smile. Before responding, Jane looked behind her one more time, staring at the man, until he turned his head back in her direction. Startled, she quickly spun around and locked eyes with the driver through the rearview mirror.
Yes,
She replied, a timid and uncertain tone in her voice. The driver's smile faded, and a curious stare formed from his face as he looked further into the mirror, sharing glances between the road and the man sitting unbothered at the back of the bus, his legs wide apart and an arm rested peacefully on the empty seat beside him as he gazed out the window. The driver leans back in his seat, his eyes returning to the road ahead.
You at the back. Coming off soon.
The man looked to the empty seats on his right, then looked ahead to see everyone in the bus staring at him, including Jane.
No, I'll let you know when my stop is near.
He replied with a nonchalant demeanor before shifting his eyes to Jane. Jane's discomfort expanded as the man continued to look at her, his eyes apathetic and calculating. She turned her head around and shifted uncomfortably in her seat, feeling a tingle from his stare running down her back. She reached for her purse and was about to go back to scrolling on her phone when she remembered that her stop was close. Relieved, she lowered her purse down to her lap and held her head high, watching the stretch of road through the large windshield of the bus. Maybe she wouldn't get robbed after all, Jane thought, a relaxing surge of relief entering her body. The whistling wind sailed through the windows, delivering a soft gust of cool night air, followed by the creaking of the seats and floors as the bus came to a stop at a red light before an intersection. While the bus was immobile, Jane leaned forward in her seat, her eyes angled up at the rearview mirror.
I'm coming off at the next stop,
she said quite eagerly. As soon as the light turned green, the bus rumbled off, crossing the dimly lit intersection before stopping at a bus stop. The doors flew open with a thud, inviting a cool breeze that whistled past the entrance. Jane gathered her things and stood up, preparing to make a quick exit. She wasted no time in getting off the bus and stepped out into a gust of wind that lifted her hair, blowing her anxious thoughts back into the bus. Without looking back, Jane began to walk along the sidewalk, feeling a sense of relief once she heard the door shut and the engine churn up. She no longer had to be around someone like that, who made her uncomfortable, and was just happy that she could finally get home. The bus drove off and passed her, sending a strong wind that pressed hard against her body, launching her legs forward and temporarily increasing the tempo of her walk. She sauntered along the corner of the partially lonely street, her heels clicking against the ground as she passed under several bright street lights and passed by a couple lively clubs and bars, still active past 12 o'clock. As she went along the sidewalk, she saw two men standing by the entrance of a club with colorful neon lights that spinned outside like a laser. One of the men greeted her, while the other turned his gaze down the street behind her. Picking up on his gaze, Jane looked over her shoulder, only to see the same man that was on the bus with her, strolling along with his hands buried in his pockets and his hoodie over his head. Jane's heart sank once more. It could not be a coincidence or a misunderstanding. She believed that this man was definitely up to something, and it was now obvious that he had to have been trailing her. She desperately turned to the men standing outside the club, a look of fright and terror in her eyes.
Please help me,
She pleaded. The men standing at the entrance of the club looked at each other, one with pursed lips, the other with furrowed brows.
What's the matter?
One of the men asked.
That man has been stalking me ever since I got off the bus.
Jane exclaimed, her arms stretched down the sidewalk, pointing at the black man strolling toward them nonchalantly. The men outside the club turned their bodies to the black man in the hoodie walking toward them, a suspicious frown on their faces as they waited for him to come close. As the black man came within feet of her, Jane wrapped her arms around herself, nervously lowering her head and shifting her body to the men outside the club. The men noticed her discomfort, and one of them stepped out onto the sidewalk, blocking the black man's path, causing him to stop walking.
Got a minute there, fella?
The man who blocked him asked. The black man withdrew his hands from his pockets and pulled back the hood from over his head, his eyes rotating between the two men and Jane. What was going on? Why did this man suddenly block his path? The man wondered to himself.
Why have you been stalking this lady?
One of the clubmen asked sternly, brows raised all the way, and the black man looked at Jane in disbelief.
What? I wasn't stalking anybody?
He declared. Feeling a bit braver having these men to help her, Jane held her head high and turned to the black man with a scowl.
You were stalking me. Even when we were on the bus, you kept looking at me every minute and making me uncomfortable. When I got off the bus, you got off too and followed me all the way here.
She said out loud. The black man pursed his lips in an annoyed manner, looking at Jane contemptuously.
Why are you doing this?
He asked, then turned to the men outside the club.
I'm just going about my business. I don't care about this lady.
He stated to them. The men outside the club looked down the street, and one of them smiled.
Yeah, tell that to them.
One said, pointing his chin at a patrol car coming from the intersection. The black man turned around and sighed deeply, a warm and heavy breath that escaped from his nostrils like mist in the cool night air. Looking at the patrol car with eyes of disappointment, he knew what was about to happen. It was not the first time he had been in this position, and he knew that if he was to come out of this okay, it would surely not be the last. One of the men walked out into the road and fanned at the patrol car, while the other stayed blocking the black man from moving. From behind his windshield, the officer noticed the man's arm fanning in the air and saw 3 other people behind him on the sidewalk. The officer spun the car over to the side of the road and pulled over beside the club, carefully exiting the car with his hand resting above his belt.
What is the matter here?
The officer asked in a rough tone, an impatient frown on his face as his eyes scanned everyone on the sidewalk.
This young lady came to us seeking refuge and said that this man here was stalking her.
One of the clubmen reported. Jane quickly stepped up to the officer.
Yes, officer. I was on a bus coming from my work, and the bus stopped to pick up this strange man. He came in all hooded up, hiding his face, and sat right behind me. I felt uncomfortable with him behind me, so I went to another seat. But he kept staring at me from the back of the bus, and I think he was probably trying to see what he could steal because I had my money and other important things in my purse. I felt the discomfort until I reached my stop and got off, thinking I was clear. But he got off the bus too and started following me. I was afraid and didn't know what to do, so when I saw these men, I hurried to them and asked for help, and they got him to stop harassing me.
Jane explained. The black man released a heavy, burdened sigh, shaking his head bitterly at Jane. The officer turned from Jane and looked at the black man, his eyes running up and down his body in suspicion, a strict glare emitting from his weathered face. The officer pointed to the hood of the patrol car.
You lay down so I can search you.
He instructed. The black man pressed his palms against his chest.
But don't I get to explain myself, officer?
The officer's lips twisted impatiently, tightening his grip on his inventory belt, which had his gun holster attached to it.
You can talk after I search you.
The black man bit his lip, a shine of moisture in his eyes as he looked at Jane, the men from the club, and finally the officer. Everyone was already sold on the idea that he had criminal intentions. So, not wanting to escalate the situation, he did as told and laid down on the hood of the patrol car. The officer patted him down and searched him thoroughly, and Jane watched on in satisfaction and relief as he was investigated.
So can I talk now, officer?
The black man asked while in the middle of being searched. The officer leaned up off of him, holding the man's wallet up to his face.
Sure, Mr. Wallace.
The officer read his name on his ID.
You don't seem to have any weapons or anything. You can get up.
Wallace leaned up off of the car, his head lowered to the ground, his shoulders slouched slightly. He raised his head to look at the officer, a sorrowful stare and a clench of his jaws.
I was just on my way back from the gym and hopped on a bus to get home, nothing more. From the moment I got on the bus, this lady would not take her eyes off me, but I never paid any mind to it and never said anything to her. I saw her getting off at her stop, which just happened to be the same stop I always come off at. I had a long day at work. I just want to get home, officer.
He explained calmly. Hearing his explanation, Jane's nostrils flared up and her brows furrowed in a scowl. She turned to the officer with her finger pointed at him.
He's lying.
She declared out loud.
I have never seen him around here before. He was stalking me. He wouldn't stop watching me, and he kept following me until I came to these men.
The officer looked at Wallace judgmentally, a strict glare that made Wallace sigh once more and shake his head.
Where exactly around here do you live?
The officer asked. Wallace raised his arm and pointed up the street.
Just right there, apartment B3. I have my keys and everything,
he said as he jingled his pockets. Jane gasped out loud, a look of disbelief on her face as she looked up the street.
That can't be. I live there, and I've never seen him. I know everyone who lives in that complex. They're decent people. I've never seen his kind there.
She detested scornfully. Wallace scratched his head, a frustrated gaze at the sidewalk as he licked the insides of his mouth with his tongue.
I just moved here about a week ago, and because of my shift, I only get to go home at night. This is one big misunderstanding. You must not have seen me because I'm only there at night.
The officer raised his head at Wallace.
So tell me, Mr. Wallace, what kind of job do you do?
Wallace looked at the officer with a resentful grin.
I'm an officer just like you. I was assigned here last week.
Silence immediately fell upon the sidewalk. The officer began to rub his jaws. Hearing this, his tongue rolled up into a corner of his mouth as his eyes anxiously wandered across the sidewalk. The two men standing by the entrance of the club looked at each other in silent shock. Jane looked on with her eyes wide in disbelief, looking at his clothes, his shoes, and his skin complexion.
There's no way someone like you could be a cop. You're a stalker.
Jane detested it, refusing to believe it. Wallace reached his hand over his shoulder and lifted around his backpack. He unzipped a secret compartment of his bag and took out his badge and ID, holding it up for Jane and the officer to see. Jane's arms dropped at her sides, and she took a step back with her eyes scattered all over the place, her brain trying to process the revelation she had just witnessed. While she went quiet, the men from the club turned back inside, leaving them all to sort out their problems. The officer lifted his hand from his belt and rested it on the roof of the patrol car, an awkward smile on his face as he tried to make sense of the situation.
Well, Mr. Wallace, you're free to go,
the officer said as he turned back to his patrol car. Jane's mouth gaped at this, and she reached out her hand to the officer, still afraid of the black man.
But sir, you're not going to do anything about him stalking me.
The officer stopped from entering the vehicle and looked over his shoulder with an impatient frown.
You both just happen to live in the same complex, so naturally you'd both be going in the same direction. This man is not stalking you, ma'am. Have a good night,
he said as he dipped his head with a smile, then entered his car and drove off. Jane's heart sank as she watched the patrol car drive off down the road, and feeling a tingling in her spine, She turned around to see that she was now alone with Wallace. Her heart began to accelerate, pounding in her chest like a drum. She still didn't trust the man and refused to accept that he was good. Seeing the fright on her face, Wallace held out his palms before his chest.
Please calm down, lady. I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to get home.
He then pointed to the other sidewalk across the street.
See, I'm going to go across the street, so we don't have to be near each other. I'm not going to harm you or anything. I'm an officer of the law. Okay.
Jane just stared into his face catatonically, her mouth hung open in disbelief. Seeing her look at him like a spectacle, Wallace shook his head and strolled across the street to walk on the other side. Jane watched him carefully from the other side of the road and waited until he had gone a good distance ahead of her before she started walking again. Relieved to be free of his presence, Jane's heartbeat began to finally settle, and the stress disappeared from her face. She no longer had anything to worry about, and her apartment was now just a few steps ahead past an alleyway. As Jane walked, she felt a buzz in her purse and opened it to see the screen of her phone lit up with a notification message. She stopped walking at the entrance of an alley to open the message, and as she was reading it, a man jumped out from the shadows and shoved her to the ground, sending her phone bouncing across the sidewalk. The man quickly rushed to pick up the phone, then stood over her with a knife, a cold grimace on his face as he pointed to her purse.
Give me that now.
He ordered her. Jane's body quivered uncontrollably in utter terror, and she released a high-pitched scream from the bellows of her stomach that reverberated all over the vacant streets. The man gritted his teeth at her and kneeled down to press one of his hands over her mouth, trying to rip the purse from her hands as she held on tightly. From all the way up the street, Wallace heard her desperate screams and turned around to see a white man pinning her to the ground and trying to grab her purse. His body twitched out of instinct to run back the way he came, but he stopped himself and thought about how she had treated him earlier. The way she had discriminated against him and almost got him in trouble. A part of him was hurt and wanted to let her get robbed by this man to show her that looks don't determine a person's character. But even though off-duty, he was still an officer of the law, tasked to protect and serve. He couldn't watch an innocent citizen get robbed or hurt and not do anything about it. He had to do something. As well, when Wallace imagined seeing his mother or his sister in Jane's shoes, he would want them to receive help. He wouldn't be happy with himself if he allowed this to happen. Without wasting another second, Wallace threw down his bag to the concrete and dashed across the street, sprinting down the sidewalk toward the robber and Jane. While the robber was preoccupied with pulling away Jane's purse, Wallace ran up to him and shoved him with all of his strength, sending the robber tumbling down hard. Startled, the robber crawled to his feet frantically, accidentally dropping Jane's phone as he ran off down the street like a madman. Wallace bent down to check on a traumatized Jane, helping her to her feet as she trembled and clutched her purse close to her chest. He walked over to her phone and picked it up, brushed it off, and attempted to hand it to her. But she didn't reach out and stood frozen, looking at him in shock. Jane could not believe that the same man who she had thought would have robbed her would come and save her from being robbed. A sad sulk on her face, she looked into his eyes, burdened with an overbearing sense of guilt, remembering how she judged him. She felt disappointed in herself and knew not how to express her gratitude after what she had done to him. What was she to say for herself?
Here's your phone.
Wallace said as he raised it to her again. And this time she took it from his hand.
Thank you.
She paused and looked away from him with shame in her eyes, trying to gather her words. She released a sigh, then attempted to look him in the face earnestly.
I apologize for misjudging you. I was terribly wrong. I thought you were a bad person, but it turned out that I was actually the bad one,
she said, returning her eyes to the ground in shame. Wallace found it hard to accept her apology, but he nodded his with a forced smile, brushing off his hand before sliding them into his pocket.
At least you have seen the error in your ways. I accept your apology.
Hearing this, a shower of relief came over Jane, washing off all of her shame and self-contempt. She smiled at him.
Thank you. Next time I won't be so quick to judge.
Wallace nodded back with a smile.
Well, it's going to 1 now. It's very dangerous for you to be outside at these hours. I think you should head home,
he said, looking up the street at his apartment.
Right. Thanks again.
Jane replied before walking off, happy to finally be done with the road. Thus, they both walked down the sidewalk together until they parted ways and went to their respective apartments. while Wallace was to bed, grateful that things didn't take a wrong turn. Jane went to bed with a new perspective on life. What she learned that night would stick with her for the rest of her life. The lesson that looks can be very deceiving, and that one should not judge a book by its cover.